Believe it or not, once upon a time, I actually began to work out. I went to a gym almost every day of the week, and I did my thing and that kind of stuff. But I remember one time I was at the gym and I was running on the treadmill or something, and all of a sudden I got this terrible pain in my foot, right on the heel of my foot, and I tried to ignore it, and I kept trying to run on the treadmill, and it kept hurting more and more and more. And this went on for days. I tried every home remedy. Everybody I talked to had a different remedy. You know, try soaking it in this, or try rubbing this kind of stuff on it, or whatever. I tried everything I could possibly think of, but instead of getting better, my foot only hurt more and more and more. And finally, one day I couldn't take it anymore. I was at the office. I said, I've got to go to the doctor. I can't take it anymore. I've tried everything. There appeared to be nothing wrong on the outside of my foot. I couldn't see any visible problem, but there was something very, very wrong. I went to the doctor, who incidentally ended up doing surgery on my foot, which wasn't very pleasant. But the point of that story is, I had to get to that point. I had to try everything under my own power to make my foot feel better, and all the king's horses and all the king's men and all the advice of others and all that kind of stuff. And finally, I had to go seek the solution that I should have sought to begin with. That's a little bit like our faith. Sometimes God is our last resort, even though that's probably where we should have turned to begin with. I saw a bumper sticker one time, and it said, when you've tried everything else, try God. When you've tried everything else, try God. It's a recognition of the fact that we're like that we're going to try every other path that we can go down. We're going to try every other solution to life's problems and that sort of stuff. But ultimately, for many of us, we end up realizing what we should have realized in the very beginning, which is that God is the answer to begin with. That's where we find ourselves today in this passage of Scripture. We find two different people who are at the end of their rope in two different ways. We have one fellow, his name is Jairus, and his daughter is dying. Now, he is a person of position. He's a synagogue leader in this culture. He's a religious man. And he has come to Jesus this day saying that my little girl, we learn later in the passage of Scripture that she's 12 years old, my little 12-year-old daughter, the apple of my eye, my precious kid, lays dying. Will you come and will you help? Now, as a dad, I realize this, that for him to even utter those words, that my little girl is dying, that he's probably already gone through this process of trying everything else. If he's gotten himself mentally to that point where he admits that his little girl is dying, that nothing else can be done, he's probably at that point. So we meet this desperate dad in the story, and he's there. And then later on, who pops up but a woman who, the Scripture is very clear, 12 years of trying to heal this persistent chronic condition that she's had. A dozen years. She's spent all she has. The Scripture said she's gone to many different doctors. She probably was like I was. She tried every path, and we find her on this day, not even with the energy or the courage to try to summon Jesus' attention to ask for his help, but coming to him this day thinking, if only I can touch the cloak of his garment, if I can get that close, then I will be healed. And indeed, she is. Now, what's the common element here? We have two people who are at the end of the rope. They're coming to Jesus, but they're coming to Jesus in faith. They've tried everything else. They've tried every other path. They're coming to Jesus in faith that if only I can get Jesus to pay attention to my problem, then things will be better. And indeed, they are. Sometimes desperate people have a little easier time accepting and believing in Jesus. And that's often what has brought us to faith to begin with. Story after story of somebody who says, you know what, I was leading a life that was going this way, and I tried doing things my own way and that sort of stuff, and one day I found myself at the end of my rope, and I came to faith in Jesus. Or somebody died who was close to me, and that's kind of where the rubber meets the road sometimes in our faith, where we have to say, you know, do I believe it? Is it all true that there really is something after this life, and that sort of stuff? And so sometimes we come to that point and we say, yeah, I have faith that this isn't all there is in this life. And so sometimes from our perspective, faith is a last resort, but faith is what makes all the difference. Now, if these two people had shown up more on a lark saying, you know, I'm just going to give Jesus a shot, I've tried everything else, I don't really think it's going to work, but I'll try it anyway, it wouldn't have worked. because it was their faith. Their faith was the engine that drove the miracle in both of these cases. Second thing that's interesting about this passage of Scripture, though, is that we really have nothing more than interruptions going on. Jesus is busy. Now, if you go backwards in this passage of Scripture, back a chapter or so, you're going to see Jesus has actually been busy for days, ministering to people. He's been on this boat, kind of crossing over this lake. He's come back over to the side. A lot of people are around. Jesus can't seem to quite shake a crowd of people right now. Everywhere he goes and everything he does, people are watching it. People are there. They're pressing into him. Everybody, think of it this way, everybody wants a piece of Jesus right now. Wherever he goes. And this is his perspective. So in the middle of all that chaos, in the middle of all those people undoubtedly vying for Jesus' attention, he manages to pay attention to, first, one interruption when Jairus shows up requesting his help, and then an interruption within an interruption when this woman shows up. Now, what's the message in that for you and for me? Well, for me, it means that Jesus, God, is a multitasker. He indeed does hear every single prayer and every single petition. And I think sometimes when we're praying as Christians, when we're seeking God's help for something, sometimes we think, you know what, let me just kind of not bring this to God because God's busy. God has a lot going on. There are bigger problems in the world than my little deal. But understand this clearly. God hears every prayer. God is a God that deals in the interruptions. You're not going to overwhelm God with your piddly little, puny little questions, concerns, needs, and petitions. That's not going to happen. Jesus' ministry happens in the interruptions, and I think also ours does too. If you call yourself a Christian this day, know that you are called into ministry. By virtue of your baptism, you're called into ministry. We all are. When we put on the clothing of Christ in baptism, we're sent out into the world to be salt and to be light. And the way this works isn't just in a nice little schedule. You can't take out your iPhone and block off Tuesdays from 1 to 1:45 to serve Jesus. That's not the way it works. It's going to be when you're least expecting it, you're on your way somewhere, you're focused, and then somebody comes into your path and says, hey, do you have a second to talk? Now, in that moment, realize that that very well could be a divine appointment. God has placed you into that person's path at that very time for a very specific reason. So think back to this story. Think about how Jesus operates. Jesus is approached by someone in the middle of doing something else that may have even seemed to be more important, dealing with this big crowd of people. But in that moment, he looks into the person's eyes and says, yes, I'll go with you. I will pay attention to you. I will work with you in this situation. This week, that's your challenge. That's my challenge. Where's the interruption in your life that could take place this week that may well make all the difference? I'll see you in part 2.